It had been raining all morning, a steady drizzle that blurred the outlines of the old quadrangle and left the stones glistening as though freshly cut. I remember the hollow sound of my own steps beneath the cloisters, a rhythm that seemed to mock the silence pressing down from the vaulted roof. There are places in Oxford where the air itself feels weighted with centuries of whispered confidences. That morning, the cloisters were such a place. Lewis had been beside me, though he said very little. He rarely did when I lapsed into one of those moods of quiet scrutiny, and I had long since ceased to explain myself. He asked if the note had mentioned a time. I told him it had not. Only a location, a meeting, implied rather than promised, an invitation or perhaps a lure. And I had accepted, though with the same unease one feels upon seeing a crossword setter employ a word with too many possible solutions. We paused at the junction where the cloisters narrowed into shadow. I studied the stone bench set against the wall, damp, deserted, faintly mossed at the base. No one there, only the trailing echo of water dripping through some unseen fissure. Lewis shifted, his shoes squeaking against the wet flagstones. No need for words. Whoever had summoned me had chosen not to appear. Yet absence, too, can be instructive. I found myself staring at the carved inscription above the arch, half-eroded Latin commemorating a benefactor whose name had long ceased to stir memory. I traced the letters silently, noting the gaps, the way the rain had worn away consonants as though editing a careless draft. It occurred to me, then, that the note itself had been full of such absences. No name, no handwriting I could place, no return, only the words you will understand when you see. And I had seen nothing but wet stones. Lewis muttered that we might wait. I shook my head. Whoever had written it knew precisely the effect of emptiness. To summon a man and then withhold the meeting is itself a kind of message. The message being, you are being watched, you are being measured. Perhaps even you are already too late. We walked slowly on, the cloisters swallowing our figures into gloom. Somewhere a door banged shut, the sound reverberating like a warning. I thought of the crossword I had left unfinished on the desk that morning, 5 across. A word for silence, 6 letters. I had written hushes, then erased it. The clue had spoken of cloisters, of echoes. Now I found the word returning with an insistence that felt less than accidental. Murmur, whisper, secret, each a possibility, each inadequate. Much like the case itself, already forming in my mind without substance, without shape. Lewis asked, somewhat plaintively, whether we should report the note. To whom? I replied. To the very people who may have sent it? No. Better, I said, to wait, to observe, to let the silence offer its own hints. He frowned at that, but there was nothing more to say. As we emerged into the quadrangle, the rain slackened, though the air retained its chill dampness. A group of undergraduates hurried past, their laughter cutting through the solemnity like a knife. I watched them vanish beneath an archway and wondered, not for the first time, whether innocence is always merely ignorance dressed in brighter colors. The note lay folded in my pocket, light as breath, yet heavy enough to shift the balance of the day. I knew, even then, that the missing presence in the cloisters was no mistake. It was a prelude, a tuning of the strings before the darker melody began. Oxford had many corners where shadows collected, but that morning the shadows felt rehearsed, deliberate, and though I could not yet see the shape of the pattern, I felt the old ache of anticipation, the first echo of a case that would not soon release me. The obituary appeared 2 days later, buried not in the principal column of the Times, but in that perfunctory space allotted to the moderately distinguished, where lives of considerable substance are compressed into a few column inches. I read it over breakfast, my tea cooling unnoticed beside me, and thought how the line between recognition and obscurity is no broader than the edge of a razor, Professor Edmund Latimer, aged 63, classical scholar of some renown, contributor to various academic journals, survived by no wife or children. That was all. His career, a handful of titles. His death, a single sentence. Lewis, glancing across the paper, asked if I had known him. I said only by reputation. A reputation, I added, which in Oxford is usually worth little more than the opinion of the last common room argument. But Latimer was not entirely unknown to me. Years before, I'd attended a lecture of his in the Sheldonian Tacitus, I believe, on the corrosive effect of empire upon the private conscience. I remembered nothing of the argument, only the slow, meticulous cadence of his delivery, as though the words were coins he weighed before offering them to the listener. A man of precision, then, though not of warmth. The obituary was accompanied by a small photograph, a face thin to severity, spectacles reflecting the light in a way that obscured the eyes, but the mouth, tight and unsmiling, betrayed something colder, less inclined to the compromises of ordinary affection. One imagined such men better suited to libraries than to life. And yet he was gone, and the library remained. Later that morning I walked to the Bodleian, where Latimer's name lingered faintly in catalogues and footnotes. The smell of old bindings drifted up like incense, and the hush of the place seemed, as always, more eloquent than speech. A librarian discreetly mentioned that Latimer had been in declining health, though the obituary had neglected to mention illness. He leaned closer as he said it, as if to confess a private heresy. He'd seemed afraid the last time they spoke. Afraid of what, he could not say. I carried that remark with me as I traced the scholar's legacy in the index of journals, slim articles on Latinology and moral philosophy. The titles themselves were suggestive. One, written only last year, on the tension between public honor and private disgrace. I copied it down, not knowing yet why the phrasing felt less academic than confessional. Latimer had not been the first to disguise a cry for help as an exercise in erudition. When I left the Bodleian, the afternoon was already dimming into drizzle. Lewis had been waiting outside, damp coat collar turned up, his patience wearing thin. He asked whether I had found anything. I replied that I had found a silence more articulate than words. He looked puzzled, but said nothing further. We walked together along Broad Street, our reflections trembling in the wet paving. It was in the Radcliffe camera that I made the first, smallest deduction of the case. A student brushed past, dropping a folded sheet of paper. I stooped to retrieve it, intending to return it, but the youth was gone before I could call. The paper contained a crossword, mostly blank, save for a few tentative entries. One clue caught my eye. 7 down the final resting place of scholars. 6 letters. The answer leapt out. Inevitable. Oxford, a city that was, for some, as much a tomb as a home. I thought of Latimer again, of his measured voice, his obituary no longer than a paragraph. Oxford had been his cradle and his coffin both. And perhaps, in the end, he had known it too well. Lewis noticed the paper in my hand. I said nothing, only folded it and slipped it into my pocket. A triviality, perhaps, but I had learned long ago that trivialities are often the hinges on which heavier doors swing. The sound of the bells drifted across from St. Mary's, hollow and unhurried. I felt then, faintly, that the case had already begun to right itself not with revelations, but with omissions. With the things unsaid in an obituary, the empty benches in a cloister, the fear hidden in a scholar's eyes. The pattern was not yet clear, but the outline was beginning to darken against the rain-streaked glass of Oxford's sky. Corpus Christi has always struck me as an enclave within an enclave, its quadrangles so compact that one might mistake it for a private chessboard, the black and white squares furnished not with pawns but with scholars. That morning, the gate porter received us with a politeness that felt rehearsed, as though he had repeated the same lines to generations of interlopers. His eyes, however, flicked towards me with a brief hesitation, not hostility, but the mild disquiet of a man who knows something is being withheld within his walls. Lewis asked if the college had spoken publicly about Latimer's death. The porter replied, after a pause, that there had been a notice pinned discreetly to the common room board. No public statement, no memorial planned. A private grief, then, or an embarrassment disguised as silence. I could not yet tell which. We walked through the quadrangle, rain dripping from the carved heads along the cornice. The chapel bell had just ceased, leaving in its wake a stillness that seemed more oppressive than the sound itself. I've always found Corpus oppressive, its neatness too exact, its courtyards too self-sufficient. A closed world is rarely a comfortable one unless you belong. And Latimer, I suspected, had never quite belonged anywhere, not even here. The senior tutor met us in a room lined with portraits. He spoke with measured courtesy, his tone that of a man accustomed to translating scandal into administrative vocabulary. Latimer, he said, had been on leave of absence for health reasons. Nothing unusual. The college had extended every courtesy. I asked whether Latimer had many visitors. Few, came the reply. He was a man of books, not of people. The portraits above us seemed to nod in confirmation. Scholars preserved in oil, their eyes fixed somewhere above human company. Lewis pressed him about Latimer's rooms. Would we be permitted to see them? The senior tutor hesitated before producing a set of keys. His reluctance was palpable. He added, as though to absolve himself, that the rooms had already been inspected by the bursar. There was nothing unusual, which, of course, was precisely what made them worth inspecting. The staircase creaked beneath our weight, each step a protest at intrusion. Latimer's room smelled of dust and stale tobacco. The curtains had been half drawn, the desk cluttered with books arranged not by subject but by size, as though tidiness were more important than sense. On the mantelpiece lay a small collection of postcards of Roman ruins, each photographed in winter light. None were inscribed, none sent. Only images of decay are preserved for private contemplation. Lewis remarked that the room felt lifeless. I disagreed. It felt too carefully arranged, like a stage set from which the actor had slipped away before his cue. On the desk, I noticed a sheet of paper turned face down. Lifting it, I found a crossword, completed in neat, angular handwriting. All but one clue filled. 11 across the place of ultimate truth, 5 letters. He had left it blank. Not forgotten, I thought, but resisted. A man who completes every square does not overlook the simplest. He withholds. I folded the sheet and placed it in my pocket. Lewis asked whether I thought it meant anything. I replied that everything means something, though not always what we expect. He sighed, no doubt weary of my evasions. But the blank square continued to occupy my thoughts long after we left the room. Outside, the rain had ceased, though the stone still glistened with its residue. A few students hurried past, their gowns flapping behind them like shadows fleeing pursuit. I wondered how many of them had ever spoken to Latimer. How many would remember him as anything more than an empty seat in the hall? Corpus, with its closed gates and cloistered precision, has a way of erasing the inconvenient. Death, too, can be inconvenient, particularly when it refuses to explain itself. As we passed back through the quadrangle, the porter's eyes followed us once more. I recalled the faint tremor in his hands when he had signed us in, and it occurred to me that fear often resides not in those who are questioned, but in those who remain silent. A closed world may hide its truths, but even the most sealed of walls allow echoes to escape. It is only a matter of listening to them. The evening found me, as so many evenings have, in the half-gloom of a pub not far from the river. The rain had cleared, leaving the windows streaked and the air inside thick with a warmth that seemed almost conspiratorial. A place of modest comfort, with oak beams bent by time and a carpet that smelled faintly of old ale. Lewis, practical as ever, ordered a pint. I asked for a glass of red. There are times when beer seems to surrender to banality, and this was not one of them. He asked whether I believed Latimer had enemies. The question hung in the air, casual in tone yet heavy with its own inevitability. In Oxford, enemies are rarely forged with fists. They are born of a phrase in a footnote, a correction delivered too swiftly, a grunt lost to a rival. Words, not weapons. I told him as much. He frowned into his pint and said that words could cut as deep as knives. He was right, though I suspect he did not know how right. Across the room, a group of women sat in quiet laughter, their conversation peppered with the small intimacies of friendship. I watched them for a moment longer than I ought, drawn not by desire, but by the contrast of their world light, untroubled, while ours seemed to sink ever further into shadow. Lewis noticed and remarked, with something between amusement and reproach, that my thoughts were wandering. Perhaps they were, or perhaps I was merely allowing the world to intrude where it seldom does in the confines of colleges and libraries. It was then that a man approached our table, uninvited, his manner that of one who had rehearsed this intrusion. A lecturer in English, I later learned, though his introduction was delivered with too much haste, as though the title were meant to shield him. He spoke of Latimer in terms that balanced admiration with disdain. A brilliant mind, he said, but cruel. He destroyed reputations with his pen, reduced colleagues to footnotes in his reviews, and yet, in the same breath, he confessed that many had envied him. The Englishman's eyes shifted constantly, as though the very act of speaking Latimer's name might summon some retribution from beyond the grave. Lewis asked whether he thought Latimer had suffered. The man hesitated, then drained his glass and muttered that suffering was inevitable when one lived without affection. I asked him if he had seen Latimer recently. A shake of the head, evasive, but his fingers had betrayed him, tapping the rim of his glass in a pattern too deliberate to be nervous. ... A habit, perhaps, or a signal. Morse code. I made a note of it, silently, though I could not yet read its message. When he left, the room seemed to exhale as though relieved of an unwelcome guest. Lewis asked what I made of him. I replied only that envy and admiration often share the same glass, and the drink is rarely wholesome. He pressed further, but I let the question drift into silence. Some truths arrive only when they are ready. We lingered longer than necessary, conversation dissolving into the rhythm of clinking glasses and low voices. Outside, the cobblestones gleamed with rain, and the air carried that peculiar Oxford mixture of smoke, damp, and something older, the scent of parchment decaying quietly in forgotten cupboards. I felt the familiar tug of melancholy, the sense that whatever we pursued was less a crime to be solved than a confession waiting to be heard. As we walked back towards the station, Lewis asked about the crossword I had taken from Latimer's desk. Had I solved the missing clue? I admitted that I had not. 11 across still lay vacant, unyielding, but the word would come. I was certain. Words have a way of returning to their proper places, just as people do, sometimes too late, sometimes not at all. He shrugged, perhaps thinking me overfond of riddles, and we walked on in silence. That night, alone with my glass of whiskey, I thought again of Latimer, of his solitary rooms, his unposted postcards, the blank square left waiting for its answer. Wine, women, words. The first dulls, the second distracts, the third destroys. And somewhere among them, I felt, lay the truth of a man who had lived too long in the company of one, and too little in the company of the others. It was in the dim hush of the college library that I first began to sense the error. Not a grand revelation, not a thunderclap of certainty, but the quieter recognition that something had been mistranslated not in Latin or Greek, but in the subtler dialect of human behavior. The shelves smelled of dust and parchment, the air dry as chalk, and each footfall on the boards above us echoed with the hesitant tread of students who did not belong to the dead, but feared them all the same. Lewis had found the text, an obscure edition of Horace that Latimer had been revising. The margins bore his cramped hand, annotations layered over previous corrections until the page resembled a battlefield of meanings. I scanned one passage, a line concerning honor and ruin, and saw that he had translated decorum not as dignity, but as propriety. A small change, perhaps, yet in scholarship, as in life, the wrong word can shift the weight of everything. Lewis asked whether it mattered. I told him it mattered more than he could imagine. In Latin, propriety suggests outward show of dignity, something internal, resistant to disguise. Latimer had chosen the lesser, the more public reading. Was it a mistake or a confession? Lewis shrugged, uninterested in such niceties. But I could not leave it alone. For men like Latimer, every word is chosen as carefully as a defense in court. The librarian, a tall man with hair thinning into invisibility, approached with the caution of one who fears his own voice might disturb the bindings. He said Latimer had spent many evenings there, always alone, copying passages into a notebook that had not yet been found. I asked whether he had ever spoken to him. Once, he replied, when the professor dropped a sheet of paper. The librarian had noticed the hand tremble as Latimer retrieved it. That small tremor stayed with me long after the man withdrew, like a ripple on water that refuses to vanish. Later, Lewis and I sat in the deserted reading room. He remarked that we were wasting time with books when we should be speaking to people. I reminded him that books, too, speak though not always in the language we expect. He rolled his eyes, yet remained seated. There was something about that room, the green-shaded lamps glowing like relics of another century, that subdued even his impatience. It was then that I noticed a thin slip of paper left between the pages of an unremarkable volume on Roman satire. A bookmark, one might think, yet it was folded twice, and on opening it I found not Latin but English. A line written in the same angular hand as the crossword truth is always mistranslated. A phrase at once pretentious and strangely personal, as though meant not for posterity, but for a single reader. I slipped it into my pocket, my pulse quickening not from revelation, but from the sense that Latimer had been writing to someone, and that someone had been meant to find it. Lewis asked if it was important. I said only that it might be. But in my mind, the possibilities multiplied. Who was the intended reader? A colleague, a student, a rival? Or perhaps it had been left for no one at all, a private epigram abandoned like an empty glass on a counter. As the evening darkened, we left the library by the side door. Rain had begun again, tapping gently against the stone, a sound more intimate than insistent. Lewis asked where next. I told him that mistranslations, once made, often reveal more than the correct words ever could. He looked at me as though I had spoken in code, which perhaps I had. I often wondered how much of my thought reached him intact, and how much was lost, like Latin phrases mangled by careless students. Back in my room that night, I placed the slip of paper beside the crossword. 2 fragments, neither whole, each refusing to explain itself. I poured a measure of whiskey and considered the possibility that Latimer's life had been one long mistranslation a scholar admired for precision, yet trembling with imprecision at the edges. A man whose words had outlived him, but whose meanings remained stubbornly fugitive. I sat long into the night, listening to the rain, waiting for the silence to tell me what the words could not. It was Lewis, not I, who voiced the first theory, and I remember the faint glow of satisfaction in his tone as we walked back along the High. He believed Latimer's death to be the consequence of a long festering rivalry, some departmental quarrel, some academic grudge dressed in the dusty robes of scholarship. He listed names, half-remembered colleagues who might have borne a grudge sharp enough to outlast civility. I let him speak, watching the lamps flicker in the damp air, the reflections rippling on the slick flagstones like hesitant truths. He turned to me then, expecting agreement. I told him only that a grudge is rarely sufficient on its own. To hate a man is simple enough, to kill him requires something more exacting. Lewis frowned, his patience already thinning, and muttered that sometimes the simplest answer is the right one. I did not reply. In Oxford, I have found, the simplest answers are usually the ones least deserving of belief. We arrived at Latimer's rooms once more, the keys clinking faintly in Lewis's hand. The bursar had given permission, reluctantly, though with a warning to tread carefully. The door opened with a sigh, as though resentful of intrusion, and the stale air enveloped us again. The desk, the postcards, the meticulously arranged volumes are all unchanged, yet something about the room felt different. Perhaps it was only the weight of our suspicion, reshaping the air. Lewis searched the drawers, producing letters from publishers, a bank statement, the debris of an ordinary life. He held up one envelope, postmarked Cambridge, and said this might be the link. I asked why. He pointed to the handwriting firm, deliberate, and suggested a rival academic. Perhaps a quarrel over a translation, an article rejected, a claim disputed. I watched him as he pieced together this imagined quarrel, the evidence aligning with pleasing neatness. He seemed almost proud of it, a solution ready to hand. But the envelope was empty. The letter itself was gone. Lewis argued that this proved his case was removed deliberately to conceal the quarrel. I countered gently that absence can be interpreted in many ways. A thief hides, a mourner preserves, a man ashamed destroys. Which was it here? The room did not answer. Lewis scowled and said I was always complicating what ought to be simple. Perhaps. But simplicity, I thought, is rarely true. It was then that my eye drifted back to the crossword folded on the desk, the one I'd left untouched. 11 across, still vacant. I studied the intersecting letters once more, the pattern stubborn in its refusal. Lewis leaned over my shoulder and suggested the truth. 5 letters, it fits, but the letters would not allow it. The second square demanded an O, the third an R. Truth would not do, nor would any of the guesses we tried. I stared at the empty space and thought of Latimer, a man who had chosen propriety over dignity, silence over confession. What word had he withheld? And why? It was not merely unsolved. It was unsolvable, a puzzle designed to resist a solution. I slipped the crossword back into my pocket. Lewis sighed, irritated, and returned to his papers. He found nothing more, only scraps of evidence that might support his rivalry theory if viewed in the right light. He spoke of motives, of jealousies, of opportunities. A neat narrative was forming, one that would satisfy his sense of order. And yet the room itself resisted, the silence tugging at the edges like a thread left deliberately uncut. I felt then, as I often do, that the first solution to any case is merely a mirror held up to our own expectations. When we finally left, locking the door behind us, Lewis declared that we were close. I said nothing. The night had drawn in, the air thick with mist, and somewhere in the distance the bells of Magdalen told their slow reminder that time is never patient. I knew, as we crossed the quadrangle, that his solution was false. But false solutions have their use. They clear away the comforting lies, leaving only the harder, lonelier truths. And it is to those, always, that one must return. It was Lewis who noticed it first, though he did not understand what he was seeing. We had returned to the library late in the afternoon, the lamps glowing faintly under their green shades, shadows gathering in the corners where shelves pressed close like old conspirators. Lewis pulled a heavy volume from its place, flipped it open, and remarked almost idly that a page was missing. I moved towards him, felt the faint stir of unease rise in my chest, and saw it myself, the ragged edge where paper had been torn, hurriedly, without the care of a scholar. The violence of it seemed to echo louder than any gunshot might have done. The book was a Latin commentary, one Latimer had annotated years before, his name printed neatly in the front. The missing leaf had not gone unnoticed by time. The faint dust lines betrayed its absence, an empty rectangle among a forest of words. Lewis asked what it meant. I told him that in Oxford, a missing page is rarely an accident. The excision of words is always deliberate. He shrugged, unimpressed, and said perhaps a careless student had taken it for notes. But I thought not. A student steals books, a scholar tears out only what he cannot afford to leave behind. We carried the volume to a table, its weight heavy between us. I traced Latimer's marginalia, those tight, angular comments written with the restraint of a man who feared extravagance even in ink. He had argued with the text as with a rival. Here a correction, there a bitter dismissal, elsewhere a grudging acknowledgment. A life lived against the grain of other men's thoughts. Yet it was the missing passage that held me, like the silence in music that lingers after the note fades. Lewis asked whether we could determine which section had been removed. I measured the thickness of the gap, flipped to the preceding and succeeding chapters, and found the subject an elegy on exile, lines about the sorrow of leaving home and the impossibility of return. It seemed too pointed, too apt to be a coincidence. Had Latimer cut it because it mirrored his own fears, or because it revealed something he wished concealed? I could not yet decide. We left the library and walked across the quad, the air damp with the promise of rain. Lewis muttered that it was another dead end. I told him gently that no page is ever torn out without leaving its ghost behind. He gave me a puzzled look, but said nothing further. His patience with my metaphors was wearing thin, though I sometimes thought he understood them more than he admitted. That evening, in my room, I spread the evidence before me. The crossword, the slip of paper from the satire, the torn commentary. 3 fragments, each unfinished, each withholding its last word. I poured a measure of whiskey, lit a lamp, and stared at them as though they might arrange themselves into coherence. They did not. But in the stillness, I remembered something. Weeks earlier, I had seen Latimer in the street, his hand clasping a book against his chest with unusual fervor, a gesture too fierce for a man of his detachment. He had passed without acknowledgement, but the image remained. Perhaps it was this very commentary he had held, already scarred by its missing page. The thought troubled me, though I could not say why. I wrote a few words on a scrap of paper exile. Silence, omission, words that circled one another but refused to touch. I set down my pen, took another drink, and listened to the rain beginning once more against the window. The city outside seemed hushed, as if aware that something had been cut away from its fabric. I knew then that the case was less about what Latimer had written than about what he had erased. A man's life is rarely revealed by what he chooses to display. It is in the absences, the omissions, the torn-out pages, that truth begins to flicker. And yet, even as the thought formed, I felt the weight of uncertainty pressing closer. For every absence leaves behind not certainty, but possibility. And possibility, like Oxford itself, is infinite and unyielding. The trouble with false solutions is that they seduce not with certainty, but with plausibility. They present themselves as familiar melodies, already half-remembered, and in that familiarity lies their danger. Lewis had taken to the notion that Latimer's life had ended in scandal of the most predictable kind, a woman neglected, spurned, or betrayed. He had gathered this theory from little more than a whisper overheard in the hall, a remark about the professor's occasional dinners with a younger lecturer from Somerville. Lewis repeated it with the calm conviction of one who mistakes gossip for truth. We met her the following day in the battery of her college. She greeted us with a politeness that bore the faintest edge of disdain, as though she had been interrupted in work of greater consequence. Her features were sharp, composed, her voice low, almost scholarly in its restraint. She admitted to knowing Latimer, yes, to dining with him, even to corresponding on matters of translation. But more than that, she would not concede. No impropriety, no scandal, only a professional acquaintance, and yet her eyes, when she said it, drifted briefly to the window, away from ours, as if to place distance between truth and speech. Lewis, satisfied, took her glance as confirmation. I did not. Back in the quad, he declared that the matter was settled. Jealousy, betrayal, a falling out disguised as academic courtesy. I let him speak, but in my mind the pieces refused to align. A woman of such composure does not break easily, nor does she bind herself to a man as brittle as Latimer. And yet she had spoken one phrase that lingered. She said he often misread people, not misjudged, not misunderstood, but misread the word of a translator, deliberate, precise. I wondered whether she had offered more than she knew. That evening we walked through the cloisters of Corpus again, rain dripping from the stone mouths of the gargoyles. Lewis pressed me. Did I not see the sense of his solution? I told him only that sense and truth are not always companions. He grumbled, calling me obstinate. Perhaps I was. But in the echo of our footsteps, I kept hearing her phrase. Misread. The very word Latimer himself might have written in the margin of some disputed text. Did she mean that he misread her, or that he misread us all? Either way, the implication unsettled me. Later, in my room, I took out the crossword once more. 11 across remained vacant, the blank square taunting me like a silence in conversation. I tried to read her words. 4 letters, too short. Misread, 7, too long. Neither would fit. I set down the paper in frustration, poured myself a measure of whiskey, and sat listening to the rain. Yet the more I turned it over, the more it seemed to me that the crossword and her remark belonged to one another, fragments of a larger sentence still beyond my grasp. Lewis telephoned, eager to report that he had found further evidence in Latimer's drawer, mentioning a meeting at Somerville. He sounded triumphant. I asked to see it. When I did, my unease deepened. The note was unsigned, typed, brief. A place, a time, nothing more. Lewis insisted it prove the affair, but the absence of a signature was precisely what troubled me. A lover writes her name, a conspirator does not. I suggested as much. He dismissed it as hair-splitting. Perhaps he was right. Yet I felt the chill of something more deliberate, something contrived. When the night deepened, I spread the evidence before me. The crossword, the torn commentary, the slip of satire, the unsigned note, each a fragment, each resisting solution. I thought of Latimer, of his precise hand, his preference for propriety over dignity. His silence is more eloquent than his words. If he had misread anyone, it might not have been her at all. It might have been himself. Lewis continued to believe in his second solution for days. He wore it with the easy assurance of a man who prefers clarity to doubt. I envied him, even though I knew it to be false. For me, the case remained, as always, a palimpsest of words written over other words, the true text barely visible beneath the surface. And like all false solutions, his was valuable only in what it concealed the harder truth waiting patiently beneath, still half buried, like Oxford itself under the veil of rain. I've often thought that cases do not turn on brilliance or chance, but on some neglected corner of attention, a scrap of cloth caught in a hinge, a word left hanging in the air. It is always the minor detail that refuses to be silent, no matter how forcefully one tries to ignore it. For me, it came that afternoon in the porter's lodge of Corpus. where the smell of damp stone mixed with the faint tang of polish, and the light through the latticed window fell in narrow, unforgiving bars. Lewis was asking about visitors, his tone more officious than curious, while I stood at the window, gazing out into the quadrangle where rain had once more begun its fine, steady descent. The porter produced a logbook, names and times scrawled in an untidy succession, initials for most, the occasional fuller entry when formality demanded it. Lewis flipped through with little interest, pausing only at one or two names he thought might matter. I took the book from him almost idly and let my finger travel down the page. It was there, 3 weeks prior, a set of initials repeated across consecutive days. Neat, precise letters, almost identical each time, as though stamped rather than written. Too neat, in fact. I closed the book and said nothing. Lewis asked if I had seen anything useful. "Nothing conclusive," I replied, though my mind had already begun to turn. Initials are, after all, a kind of shorthand, a way of withholding more than they reveal. But the perfection of these letters unsettled me. Handwriting always betrays tremor, haste, reluctance. Only artifice conceals. Someone had been careful, perhaps too careful. We left the lodge, the porter's eyes following us with a faint unease he could not disguise. Lewis muttered that the man knew more than he was saying. I reminded him gently that silence does not always mean concealment. Sometimes it means fear. He gave me a sidelong glance, unwilling to argue. We crossed the quad in near silence. The rain had gathered in shallow pools, and each step sent ripples outward, dissolving quickly into the stone's irregularities. I found myself thinking of Latimer's postcards of Roman ruins in winter, cold, eroded fragments preserved in 2 dimensions. I had dismissed them before as curiosities, the idle souvenirs of a solitary man. But now they returned with quiet insistence. Why ruins? Why is it always winter? Perhaps it was not the images he wanted to preserve, but the season itself, the suggestion of decay, of endings. A minor detail, dismissed at first glance, now beginning to whisper. That evening in my room, I set the postcards beside the crossword and the torn commentary, arranging them like pieces on a board. Lewis would have laughed at the ritual. He preferred facts, statements, and testimonies. But I had long since learned that truth often announces itself in fragments. One card in particular drew my attention. It showed a crumbling amphitheater, its tiers half buried in shadow. On the reverse, nothing. Blank, except in the corner a faint indentation, as if a pen had pressed lightly before withdrawing. Not ink, only pressure. A word begun and abandoned. I tilted the card under the lamplight, and the impression revealed itself, hesitant, half-formed. The letter E, nothing more. Yet it was enough to disturb me. Lewis telephoned later, eager to rehearse once again his theory of the woman at Somerville. I let him speak. When he asked if I had discovered anything myself, I said only that sometimes the smallest marks carry the greatest weight. He sighed, accustomed to my evasions, and bid me good night. But the card lay before me, still, its silence louder than any statement he could make. I poured another whiskey and leaned back, listening to the distant bells sounding the hour. The case had gathered its false solutions, its diversions and shadows, yet it was the minor detail, the 2 neat initials in the porter's book, the abandoned letter on the back of a postcard that began to fix itself in my mind. A scholar may write volumes and still reveal nothing, but in what he does not finish, in what he leaves behind, the true story begins. And so I sat long into the night, haunted less by Latimer's death than by the half-written words of his life, waiting for them to complete themselves in the silence. The Bodleian closes at dusk, but that evening we had secured permission to remain. The great doors, once shut, muffled the outer world so completely that one might have believed the city extinguished, the streets abandoned, time itself suspended. Only the lamps burned in narrow halos, catching the dust as it drifted downward like secret snow. Lewis sat hunched over a ledger, frowning at the crabbed Latin while I wandered among the shelves, letting my fingers trail along the bindings. I was not searching, not in the ordinary sense. I was listening. Latimer's hand was everywhere, marginal notes, corrections, emendations, sharp reminders to future readers that a passage had been mistranslated or a phrase misunderstood. His voice, thin and angular, persisted more vividly in these margins than it ever had in speech. A man is most himself when writing what he never expects to be read. That thought struck me as I turned the page of a commentary on Ovid and saw, scrawled against a line on exile, the faint words, "The truest things lie between." Between what, he did not say. But the phrase lingered, unquiet, and I copied it down. Lewis asked if I had found anything useful. I replied that truth has a habit of hiding itself in parentheses. He muttered that he preferred evidence to aphorisms. Still, I noticed the way his eyes flickered toward my notebook, betraying a reluctant curiosity. He asked what the phrase might mean. I said perhaps nothing, perhaps everything. He shook his head, returned to his ledger. We moved to Latimer's own volumes, housed discreetly in a side cabinet. The librarian unlocked it with a look of faint disapproval, as though intrusion into the dead man's papers was itself a form of sacrilege. Inside were books worn smooth by long use, translations of Horace, Juvenal, Tacitus. In one, the Juvenal, a sheet of paper slipped out as I opened it. Not a letter, not a note, but a student essay, annotated in Latimer's spidery hand. His comments were merciless, careless, misguided, and shallow. Yet at the end, a single word, unlike the rest. Sorry. The letters are uncertain, almost trembling. It startled me, that apology. Lewis saw it too and asked if I thought it was genuine. I said I could not yet say, but in the margins of cruelty, even remorse can sometimes be found. It was then I remembered the crossword again. 11 across, that stubborn absence. I pulled the folded sheet from my pocket, laid it beside the Juvenal, and compared the angular hand. Identical, and the apology that strange, wavering sorry it was the only place his script faltered, as though, in truth, the word did not belong to him. A scholar writes with certainty, remorse writes itself awkwardly, unfamiliar with the hand it borrows. The crossword, the apology, the torn page, all fragments of a man not certain of himself, or of the words he chose. Lewis asked if I was any nearer to understanding. I told him perhaps I was further away than ever. He sighed, his patience thinning. He suggested again that we focus on the obvious, the woman, the rivalry, the quarrel. But I had begun to suspect that Latimer's death was not written in the grand narratives of scandal or envy, but in these smaller notes, these marginal truths. He had lived a life between lines, and it was there his ending must also reside. We left the library near midnight. The quad was deserted, rain darkening the stones, the lamplight pooling in shallow arcs that faded almost at once into shadow. I carried the crossword, the copied phrase, the apology scrawled in the essay. They felt heavier than evidence, heavier even than proof. They felt like confessions, though whether of guilt or of something lonelier, I could not yet decide. Back in my room, I laid the pages out across the desk. Between them, a pattern was emerging, though faint, indistinct. Not answers, not solutions, but a voice breaking through the silence, awkward and incomplete. The truest things lie between. I thought again of the margins, of the torn commentary, of the postcards with their ruined arches. A man who spent his life perfecting words had left behind only absences, fragments, apologies half-written. And I, listening in the dark, could almost hear him still a scholar whose truth lay not in what he published, but in the words he tried and failed to erase. There are words in Latin that resist translation, not because dictionaries fail us, but because their resonance lingers beyond grammar, into grief. That evening, seated once more in Latimer's rooms, I turned over such a word in my mind. Amissum, to lose. But in Latin, the word suggests not merely the absence of what is gone, but the act of having let it slip, as if loss is always a failure of one's own hand. I stared at his books, his papers, the meticulous order of his shelves, and wondered what, precisely, he had allowed to slip beyond his grasp. Lewis prowled the small space, restless, fingering spines as though the books themselves might confess. He muttered about the postcards again, ruins, ruins, always ruins, and asked whether I thought them an obsession or a clue. I said only that ruins are another form of memory, and memory is never neutral. He gave me a glance tinged with frustration, then turned back to the mantelpiece. There he found, tucked behind a stack of envelopes, a slip of paper no larger than a visiting card. He passed it to me without ceremony. A quotation in Latin, written in Latimer's unmistakable hand, "Perdidi quod amavi." I have lost what I loved. Lewis frowned. A confession, he said. Proof that it was despair, not conspiracy. I shook my head. Despair is rarely so tidy. Words written in the margins of life are seldom meant to settle matters. They are fragments, echoes, half-solutions. I folded the card and placed it in my pocket, the weight of it pressing against me like an unanswered question. We sat for some time in silence, each adrift in our own thoughts. At last, Lewis asked, almost gently, whether Latimer had loved anyone. I told him that love wears many disguises, and scholarship is among the most demanding of them. He snorted, unimpressed, and said that books cannot love back. I thought of the apology I had seen scrawled at the foot of the student's essay, the trembling letters of a man who had not mastered remorse. Books may not love us, but they bear our failings more faithfully than most people do. On the desk lay a sheet of half-finished translation. I bent over it, tracing the neat script, and saw the word elegia written above the line. Latimer had been working on an elegy, a poem for mourning, for absence. Yet halfway through his translation faltered, words crossed out, replaced, abandoned. The final line trailed into nothing. Lewis glanced over my shoulder and asked why he had stopped. Because, I replied. Sometimes there is no translation adequate to the loss. He nodded, perhaps understanding more than he wished to admit. Later, as we prepared to leave, I noticed something minor, almost trivial. The chair beside the desk bore a faint impression on the cushion, a dent not yet eased by time. Someone else had sat there recently, and for longer than a casual visit. Lewis dismissed it as unimportant, but I carried the image with me as we stepped into the damp quadrangle, the evening air heavy with mist. A scholar who prided himself on solitude had, at the last, shared his silence with another. Back in my room, I placed the card on the desk beside the crossword, the postcards, and the essay. Perdidi quod amavi. The words stared back at me, unrelenting. What had he loved? A woman, a student, a colleague, a text, or merely the life he had failed to inhabit? I tried again the crossword, the vacant square of 11 across. 5 letters, the place of ultimate truth. Could it be lost itself? The letters did not fit, yet the idea clung stubbornly. Loss, after all, is the one truth Oxford never forgets. I poured another whiskey and let the night deepen. The bells tolled their indifferent music across the damp roofs. Somewhere, in the margins of these fragments, Latimer's voice lingered, awkward and incomplete. A scholar who had lived in translation, yet found no words to translate himself. And as I sat there, alone with the silence, I felt the ache of a truth I could not quite name the Latin of loss, which no language, living or dead, has ever adequately rendered.